I previously made an Is It Worth Buying video on Silent Hill 2's remake on PC and PS5. I discussed some of the things that I did and did not like about the game thus far, but now that I've actually finished the game fully, I did want to talk a little bit about it. Now, I understand a lot of people will say, well, why are you releasing this now? Why didn't you finish this game faster? To be honest, this game resonates with me in a very interesting way, where it's not a game that I wanted to rush through. I get some people like doing that, and that's, their enjoyment of it, and they get through it pretty quickly. For me, I needed to take my time for several reasons that I will talk about in today's video, but this is a full review on Silent Hill 2's remake. Now keep in mind, it is not a comparison video with the original Silent Hill 2, but I will bring up some comparisons that I do think are valid for this discussion, because you have to look at a game like this as two things, and a lot of people are only willing to look at it as one of these two. They're either only willing to look at it as a new take, or they're only willing to look at it as a remake. Now you're gonna say, well, what's the difference? Well, one is like, this is a new game. We're only judging it based off of it being a new game. And the other is we're only judging it in comparison to the past. I think both of these are valid in some respects, but I think an extreme on either side does a disservice to pretty much everything. If you have issues, I don't do this often, but if you have issues with like very serious topics, this game just straight up is not for you. And I don't mean that in like, oh, you're a wuss. What I mean is like, this game has a lot of stuff: sexual frustration, gruesome death, depression, anxiety issues, suicidal stuff. Like, there's a lot of stuff in this game that makes it very serious, to the point where like when I talk about it on YouTube, these videos often get kind of hit with like flags and stuff like that by the system, because they don't like these kinds of games. Like, even from that standpoint, it's not a safe game. And so I think they do a good job of addressing that at the beginning of this game, but I just wanted to throw that out there for you, along with saying there will be some story spoilers in my discussion. Now, I do have a question of the day for you, which is, do you think Silent Hill's kind of back, or are you still like, nervous here? Like, what are we doing? Let me know. Now, when it comes to Silent Hill 2, I love the presentation of this game, and this was my biggest criticism going in, was the changed camera angles. And whenever I bring this up, someone says, well, hey, the game's original director, or this creative person or that creative person who worked on it, they prefer this. It's like, cool, that's great. And I do take that into account and care, but that doesn't mean I have to, right? Or that you have to. And I do think that when you change those camera angles, it really is a matter of cinematography in a way. When you're playing games like old survival horror, when you're playing games like the original Resident Evil, or I could say Resident Evil 1's remake on the GameCube that got ported up, or you're playing the old Silent Hill games, especially 1 through 4, and you're hitting these fixed camera angles that I guess are kind of dynamic as well. They're fixed, but then they'll kind of move around a little bit too. It depends on the room, right? Well, when you're doing this, it is a different experience than looking at the world from behind someone or over their shoulder, or, obviously in first person mode in a different type of game that's not here. These are all different viewpoints that will change how world design is done. I'm sure at some point someone will make a very vast fixed camera angle type thing for this game. I don't know how they do it because of some of the mechanics. They probably will mod that on PC. But as is, going into it, that was my biggest concern, is how is this going to affect the viewpoint of the game? That's something I talked about a little bit in my Is It Worth Buying? And I just want to say that I overall really like it. I think that, unfortunately, and this is kind of where I get into pros and cons, it does preserve that idea in a good way of not being able to see the whole room because of how James's flashlight works, how his field of vision works, things like that. But I also did feel like this encouraged a little bit more of a jump scare feeling, where there were certain enemies that were designed just to jump out, like go flat, jump out from behind a wall, jump out from behind a corner, jump out from behind a locker, whatever. And sometimes that's actually really cool, but the enemy amount in this game in terms of like variation, in the original, it was never that huge. Like, the variations of enemies in Silent Hill 2, there's not that many different types of enemies. They all have meaning, they're all great, I like all of them, but they didn't go crazy with it, right? And so I noticed that a lot of the times this camera angle change did make it so many different things were jumping out at me more, than I would have noticed in classic Silent Hill. That's something where I think there is a difference in the type of scare it is, but that doesn't mean that there's not horror here in terms of dread. The music is done extremely well in this game. I do think the limited angle of view with the flashlight is done very well to make you feel less powerful. However, I don't think there was a single time in this game where I ran out of ammo playing on standard. Maybe it's because I also used melee a lot, but I feel a little bit like the original Silent Hill 1 through 4. I had a harder time making it through those games. I don't know if that's a common thought process, like that this game is a little easier. I'm also older, and shooting in this way is, I think, easier than shooting from a fixed or dynamic fixed camera. So regardless, maybe that's just the nature of the design, but I did find it easier in that way. Regardless, you could crank up that difficulty. I didn't, because I just wanted to enjoy the game. But I have noticed that being a big criticism is people saying the game is too easy. Now, when it comes down to a translation from the original, there are a lot of things that I think are slightly different, but also a lot of things that I think are expanded on even better. Now, I know that that is a cardinal sin to say about the original Silent Hill 2. It's considered a masterpiece. It is considered this game that you cannot say a single negative thing about, but I do think that with all games, nothing is perfect. And when it comes down to Silent Hill 2, much like 1, it was a product of its time in a good way, but also in a way where you can tell, like I said, that enemy variation was not massive. Like, they weren't going to go crazy on the budget to make 50 different enemies that all represented something in James's psyche. They just weren't going to do that. So there are a certain amount of them. Now, I think that the amount of enemies that there are is great for the original game. When it comes to this game, because I would say the length is almost doubled, it feels like you're running into the same enemies over and over and over again. That's just kind of a negative I did have. I don't want this whole video to be negative. It's like, it might sound like it is. I love this game. I thought this game was fantastic, but those are just a couple of criticisms I did have coming off the bat, because I think most of the things I talked about in the original were positive. The other negative, I guess, would be that the performance and the graphical fidelity modes were not perfect at launch. There was recently an update to fix them. That update did also introduce a game-breaking bug, which I hope is fixed by the time this goes up. I know game development is complicated, but I do get kind of tired of that kind of thing happening. Now, regardless, some of you are thinking, well, Jay, what did you want them to do? You know, if they were going to make this game a little longer and people weren't going to whine about the length, because that's what would have happened if the game was 8 hours long or 9 hours long, you know, without rushing it. People would have really been upset, right? They would have said, this isn't worth the money. This is a cash grab. Why did you make this? There's no point. So obviously they had to bring something to the table that was different. There are some expanded puzzles, some different puzzles. There are more notes. There are more strange things hidden around the world that I really like that we'll get into. And I think that those all do add a lot of atmosphere to Silent Hill, where you are able to go in more buildings, interact with more elements of that world that, to me, make that world feel even more alive and less limited than in the original, and also constantly kind of had me on the edge of my seat of not knowing what was going to happen next, because even though, you know, I know the original game, not by heart, but I know it, I didn't always know, okay, well, is there going to be something different here? You know, did they add something here? Did they not? And I think that it's interesting to me that with the enemy variation, I found myself kind of almost wanting it to be less faithful. And that's weird. Like, I feel like I have to explain that. What I mean by that is that I almost wished that instead of just sticking to the original amount of enemy variations, but, you know, with some cosmetic changes, obviously, that they had done more to add new enemy types to the game. Now, I don't think that Bloober should have done that in terms of them making them up, but I do know that they did work with Masahiro Ito, the original creature designer for Silent Hill 2. I know Masahiro Ito in the original pitch, he has said that he wasn't super enthusiastic about remaking this game. Like, he didn't know if there was really a purpose to doing it, but then he decided to be involved and do it, and he ended up loving it. So I respect that to death, and I love it too. And Masahiro Ito is actually someone I really respect that I follow online. I've interacted with him a few times. I think he's a very nice man. But when it comes down to it, I do wonder if it's something where, should Bloober have said, hey, Mr. Ito, do you want to design a couple new types of enemies for this game? Maybe they did ask that and he said no. And on further research when I was editing this, it does appear that Masahiro Ito did not want to add more monsters to the game. He wanted to improve ones that he felt were limited by the past, which I do understand and respect. But before I get back to my point was just, from an artistic standpoint, I understand that. But from a game design standpoint, because this is also a video game, people conflate Silent Hill as just like an artistic experience. It's also a video game that you play through for fun. There does hit a point when you are playing a game that is probably 14 to 17 or 18 hours if you're not rushing it at all on a first playthrough, and having to fight the same handful of monster types over and over and over and over again, versus doing that in the original where it's like an 8 to 9 hour experience on a first time playthrough when you're not rushing it. You know, this remake is longer. I don't have a problem with it being longer, but if you were willing to add to the length, I feel like a little more variation would have gone a long way to make the gameplay less like, oh great, I ran into this enemy type again, and more like, oh, what's that scary new thing? And James was such a complex and interesting person, along with the characters around him, that it does feel like there might have been more to explore in his psyche and more creatures that could have actually represented things than just the ones from the original. So like, I respect the decision and I understand it from an artist's perspective, which I understand, you know, that's probably the perspective Masahiro Ito was looking at it from. But when I'm looking at it from the perspective of somebody playing through a video game, the longer you make that game, the harder it is to sustain it on just those original types of creatures from that time in the past when the game was significantly shorter and those enemy encounters didn't get stale because of the length of the game. I'm not sure, but I think that when you're getting into all these notes, all of these different memos, all of these different strange things in the world, but then it's the same set, different types of enemies essentially as the original. I'm not asking for more bosses or fluff. I'm just saying it could have been cool if maybe there was one or two different enemy variations that showed up in the game that represented something about James that they didn't have time to get into in the original. But that said, I do like the way that they do it. This is a little bit heavier on combat than the original was, I found, because enemies will chase you. So I found that it was easier in the original to get away from enemies. Again, I'm not sure what the general consensus is on that. I found myself fighting more in this game. Now that said, you can look at that in two ways. James is kind of this timid guy, right? This is where we get into story spoilers. James is a bottom, just kind of in life, I would say. But I did find with James being so much more combat focused in the remake that it is something where it's like, you can look at it and you can look at the hidden meaning. You can say, okay, well, there's violence against women here, which we know plays into this game. You know, there's more sickness. You can hear the enemies coughing. You can hear the enemies gagging, throwing bile at you. It's pretty disgusting in a lot of ways. And, you know, they do still represent these same psychological aspects, which if you want to get more into, you can look on the wiki or you can watch one of the 500 different video essays getting into those psychological aspects of the enemies. But that said, I do think that with that, it's interesting to see it be more combat focused because it's not really what I'm used to from the old Team Silent style of Silent Hill. But I didn't like it any less. You know, I think that's worth noting is that I still thought that the way that they presented the world was very good. I found myself very nervous playing this game, and I found that it, like, sure, I know someone will say, oh, well, you know, what a pushover. I found the game actually genuinely scared me. Like, it actually bothered me in some ways, where I would play it for a couple hours and I'd be like, well, I'm good for the day. Or, yep, I'm good for now. We're not going to play this anymore right now. And part of that too for me is the way the presentation of this game was done. This game, I think, did a better job actually than the original with certain elements. One of those elements would be expanding the world, like I said, but another one would actually be getting into depression and anxiety and some of those things that I have medically dealt with in my life, along with the idea of someone dying of a terminal illness. You know, my father, I don't get into this super often because whenever I do, people use it as like ammunition unfortunately, because it's the internet and people are dicks. But my father died of cancer a few years ago. And, you know, I took care of him for a very, very long time as one of his primary caretakers. And watching James, you know, go through this struggle with his wife, Mary, and kind of seeing the same thing, and where unfortunately it led with him essentially, I believe, having, I would say, a mental break, you know, having like a psychological breakdown and a psychotic episode almost, where it led to him smothering her, you know, and repressing all of this and going to Silent Hill because this town kind of called out to him in this spiritual way. To see that, it's something that hit home with me very hard. And again, you know, if you want me to talk about that in another video, I guess it'd be a much more vulnerable video. Maybe I could in the future. If you don't care, that's fine. It's not your struggle, obviously, it was mine. But it is something that helped me resonate with this character a lot, because when, you know, they show certain things in this game, in this remake, and when they showed them in the original, it's one of those things where for me, I remember thinking like these thoughts of, is this person better off alive? Like, are they happy? Like, is this suffering worth it for them when they're, you know, you can believe whatever you want spiritually. I believe in God, but, you know, some people believe in a light at the end of the tunnel. Some people don't. So some people will cling on to life as long as possible because they believe that's it. There's one life. That's what we get. Then you're done. And some people will cling on to it because they believe they have to, even though they believe in more after it. And some people will want to let go. And so the way that they presented the conversations in this game, I found a lot of the voice acting better than the original. Now, that doesn't mean that the voice acting in the original is bad. It doesn't mean that at all. I think certain times there were characters that were framed just as like a goofball, and it was actually hard to take their struggle seriously. For example, Eddie in the original. There's nothing like, he's not a useless character where you can't get the meaning out of him, but I found that in the remake, it felt like he was more unhinged, and you could also see those mental slips in him. And in those ways, I think some characters were framed better. In some ways, I think Mary was less of an abstract concept and more of a character, it felt like, where it felt like, oh, it was almost lurking there. Like you might hear something from her on the radio, you know, or you'd find a letter that connected to her, things like that. And I, you know, as someone who went through these experiences in real life, hopefully never going to end up in Silent Hill, and nor did I decide that my weapon of choice would be a pillow at the end of my father's life. Regardless, I think that as somebody who went through that, I understood how James snapped. You know, I understood how he broke. And I thought that the remake did a very compelling job of explaining those emotional aspects of the story. And it did so while also adding in some new content that was really good. Some of those letters, some of those memos, some of those notes on the wall, they do so much to expand the world. And I know someone on Twitter can post a screenshot and show a side to side and say, well, in this world in the original, there was more, or in this portion of the world in the original, there was more smoke. And in this one, there's not. So like, therefore it's bad. I know anyone can do that. I can't change people's opinions on that kind of thing, right? But what I can do is explain that for me, I found that those extra pieces of dialogue really added to the world. Speaking of additions, I do think that the new endings are incredible. There are 2 new endings, technically 3, because one was completely reworked. The one that was completely reworked is UFO. I never cared that much for the joke endings. Like, some of them are funny. I never really wanted to get them unless there was a trophy or achievement behind it, because for me, Silent Hill is more serious. But I did think that with the UFO ending, it's pretty fun that they preserve the original's intent of the UFO endings having their own continuity. I thought that was really fun, where you find these little UFO pieces of technology and stuff around the town, you get this ending, and it actually ties directly into the ending of the original Silent Hill 2 with the UFO ending, where basically they're saying in this one that this James is a clone and the original was the original, and that now the aliens have come back to take him away. Look, if you don't like joke slapstick BS endings, you're not going to connect with that. But I thought that was funny, even as someone who usually doesn't connect with them. The other new endings are both Bliss and Stillness. I believe that's all of them that have really radically changed. Now, Stillness is a play on In Water. In Water is often considered the canon ending, which by the way in this game in water is absolutely brutal. They definitely drive home the sadness, but Stillness is one where you can go through, you can get this other ending that wasn't in the original, and it plays into In Water with Mary's body in the car, and it kind of gets into this idea of like James speaking to her one last time a little more. And it's open to interpretation because you hear a car door open during the black part of the scene, if he left the car or not. Like, did he abandon his car into Toluca Lake with her body to, give her a burial, or did he go with her? But it's different than the discussion or the piece that you see in Water. Bliss is so interesting to me because it really ties into sort of a fan theory as well about James being caught in a loop. And it's up to you whether or not you choose to believe that. But Bliss essentially deals with kind of like the PTV drug from the original Silent Hill. And this is where I love what Bloober did, where they actually did these references to Silent Hill 1 and 3 and even 4 that weren't all in the original to make the world feel more connected. Because, some of those games didn't even exist yet, but obviously those characters would have existed in the world, right? And they did a really good job of sort of, I would say, adding to the world with both Easter eggs and this Bliss ending that plays off of the White Claudia flower and essentially has James enter a trance-like state where he takes this drug and then hallucinates that he's in the videotape and he doesn't see what he did. And I thought that that was done so incredibly well, and then it pans back to the actual motel room and no one's there. And it makes you wonder, okay, well, did he go through a loop? Like, did he pick the wrong choice and now he's going to be brought back to the beginning? Like, are they kind of getting into that? Because that's left open to interpretation too. Or is it something where he now is kind of alive in that fantasy, almost in a fog world of his own or an other world of his own? And that kind of open to interpretation aspect, a lot of people worried that Bloober would not be able to land it. I do think that they did. Now, did they have a template that had done a very good job of it in the original? Yes, but I think that it's still something where it would have been very easy to fumble this approach, and I love the way that they actually managed to nail it. Now, we get into another slight criticism I do have, which is that I wish that there were more variations of the endings actually than just these two added in. I really do wish that there was another variation to the Maria ending, especially because Maria's story is tragic, and her DLC add-on from the PS2 Greatest Hits version of Silent Hill 2, Born from a Wish, is not actually in here, at least as of yet. Who knows if it will be, because I know Bloober announced another project, but I do think that missing that little DLC chapter, getting into Maria, along with also not having any more, other variation of the Maria ending, that was slightly disappointing to me, because Maria is left open to interpretation. A lot of people see it as a negative ending, but in this game, I felt like Maria was a little bit more of a character, like a full-on, we got to spend more time with her, she got to talk a little bit more, do a little bit more, and it felt to me like it was something where I wished that there was another ending for Maria, other than just the pain and sadness ending, or putting her down, which is our pain and sadness ending. Now, I get that her story is tragic, and I'm not trying to sit here and say Silent Hill should be a happy-go-lucky, fun little thing where the guy always gets the girl, but it would have been nice if there was also an ending where James was allowed to move on, but also find like Maria could have found some amount of peace, regardless of how you want to do that. Now, what I mean by that is, like, it's up to interpretation. Can Maria even leave this town? That's totally up to interpretation. It's also up to interpretation if her cough at the end is Mary's same illness, or if it's just a cough, But I felt like in this version of the game, the Maria ending was actually a lot more concretely bad and less ambiguous. It was one of the few things that was less ambiguous that I wish was more. And that's why I wish that there was another variation of it where, either Maria got to move on without being brutally destroyed, or even if there was a way that they wanted to write it where James, did end up with her, which, the original does have that, but in a sad way, or maybe in a, less tragic way. There could be a way to do that too if they wanted. It just seems like they didn't want to expand on that ending. And then the trophy titles kind of tell you what Bloober thinks of these endings too. Like, for example, they call her ending a vicious cycle, which kind of implies the idea that she will get sick again and that James will be in the same situation. But for me, I always thought it was better that that was left open to interpretation. If they were going to confirm their theory on that at least, I would have preferred that they had another ending as well that kind of changed that too. But that's just me. And again, if you're saying, well, why are you asking for new stuff in a remake? They were willing to add hours to this remake, okay? That's all I'm saying. They were willing to add multiple hours of playtime to the remake. That's just something I think would have been really neat to see. I wanted to go back and add to this point just a little bit because I know someone is going to plant their feet, puff up their chest and say, Jay, you just don't understand the Maria ending. That's the point of it. And yes, I get that. I concede that. That is the point of it, that James, in a way, is clinging on to this manifestation or being that came from part of his former wife, but also part of what he wanted Mary to be. I understand that. So in some ways you can say, well, if he chooses that path, the town is going to get grumpy. Now, the actual sentience of Silent Hill, how much the Order's God is involved, if it is even real, how much Valtiel and all of these characters in lore are involved in James's story, along with the stories of all the protagonists, these things are up for debate. When you start getting into the more European Silent Hills later on, yes, of course, you start getting into more of the Silent Hill 2 repeats. The idea of this town is punishing people, and because this town, as they said in the Team Silent games, was essentially sacred land to the natives who lived here, that in the past it used to be used to manifest positive things and go on spiritual journeys, right? Very similar in a way to tulpas in lore. The idea, which I believe is from Tibetan Buddhism, I'd have to look into that more. I did some religious studies, but I don't obviously know everything. But the idea of a being born from a wish, right? Kind of like Maria, isn't it? And honestly, kind of like a lot of manifestations of the town. Now you start to get into semantics, debates, all these things. But my point is that these are interesting ideas that I think could be further delved into. And I think that with Maria especially, you have a being here who very clearly demonstrates some amount of free will, especially in her Born from a Wish DLC add-on from the original, but also is manipulated by the town and turned into what the town wants her to be at specific points. Like if the town wants Maria to die to Pyramid Head and then be reborn again, it will do it, right? And she might not even know it happened. Other times she will act more like Mary and seem to be in on it, and then go back to the normal Maria who's actually kind of scared, creeped out, and doesn't understand the situation of what's going on. Now, this is a long roundabout point and way to say that this is a very complex character, and I never thought that the Maria ending we got was a great answer to that character, even in the original, even though it was good and it was open-ended enough that when they were going back in here and willing to add hours of playtime, that's why I would have wanted to see something more, like a twist on that, where we could get more resolution to her. And I do kind of pose the question, if positive things used to come out of Silent Hill through manifestations in the lore, why couldn't something positive still come out of Silent Hill? Yes, obviously Maria is being manipulated by that town on James's journey, but it does make me wish that there was another ending where maybe you could see more of her sentience and see her actually get some resolution, possibly with James in a romantic way because she does care about him, or even on her own as just her own person. It kind of seems like every ending, Maria just gets screwed, and with them going back and adding in so much, I think it would have been really interesting to have a twist on that Maria ending that you get via some unlockables or collectibles or whatever, so that you could actually get more out of that ending and get a different version of it, like Stillness to In Water. I do also quickly want to circle back to my New Game Plus point that I made earlier and say that I like New Game Plus in pretty much every game, and I've already mentioned this, but something that I think would enhance this game a lot in the future is if they added in something like the Hyper Spray, I believe that was the name of it in the original Silent Hill 2, or they added in the Great Knife as an actual usable weapon that you could use in New Game Plus or something like that. It just kind of seems like New Game Plus doesn't have a lot of purpose other than to get some of these additional endings, which are cool, But then, you know, some of the endings I would have wanted to see more from, we didn't get. So it's a mixed bag for me where I'm like, there's so much I love about this game, but so many things when I'm playing it that I'm like, if you were willing to add to it, why didn't we add something in here, you know? And if you weren't willing to do that, why did you add all this other stuff? That's kind of where I'm sitting with certain elements of the game. Even though James is not a character that would change clothes often, Konami obviously did do the joke masks with Bloober Team, like for example the joke Pyramid Head box mask and stuff like that if you got the digital deluxe and those other deluxe versions of the game. I do think that was kind of sad, like I didn't like that. But that said, it's not sad because I don't like the idea of there being cosmetics in the game. This is like the most mild criticism ever. But it is something where I do wish that there were a couple other outfits or something you could unlock in New Game Plus for James and Maria. Just kind of something. You know, you get the chainsaw, but not much else other than access to new endings. I guess for a game like this that was so made around exploration, I thought that maybe there would be a little bit more to the New Game Plus. Like, you know, maybe more endings or maybe more cosmetics or something. Born from a Wish. Not seeing that stuff does make, to me, New Game Plus fine, but nothing like mind-blowing unless you just like using the chainsaw. One of the things that I think is too bad about this game is like, it feels hard to talk about online because there are a lot of people that are very convinced that this remake was not needed, that it's an attempt to erase history, rewrite the past, and do all these things. But I found that the remake did some things better, and that there were things that I preferred better some in the original. I also found that a lot of these explorable areas, new notes, the strange photos, which I do kind of wish, you know, led to something unless people figure out a meaning behind it. I think they're just creepy pictures. You know, I did find that a lot of these things added to the world for me, made the world feel more alive. I actually don't think there would be anything wrong, again, cardinal sin here, with someone experiencing Silent Hill 2 for the first time through this. Now you can say, well, there's never anything wrong. Okay, well, there are a lot of games like Final Fantasy VII where I think it's up to you how you want to spend your money and time, but if you're jumping into the remake without having played the original, those differences, those changes, those new timeline type things, they're not going to matter to you. Like, it's just not going to matter. You know, and I found that with this, yes, there were things that I enjoyed because I had played the original, but my wife Jill played it with me too, and I didn't find her enjoying it any less than I enjoyed the original for the very first time. So I guess for me, that was kind of a fun experiment to be like, oh, well, you know, how am I going to react to this? Someone who's played Silent Hill 2, who, you know, knows that game and likes it, compared to someone who has never tried it before. Like, how are they going to enjoy it? And kind of seeing those reactions for the first time. And for me, the things that were hitting home with this game, with the emotional elements, you know, the sickness, different things like that, they were hitting home with my wife Jill as well. And I thought that that was really cool to see. I think that's a testament to how well they translated this story to now, how well they did. Now, are there certain things that I don't find censored, but I think, you know, could have been a little bit more, you know, they could have landed nailed the landing a little more on, like, for example, the videotape? Yeah. Like, I personally think that it's a little hard to tell in the videotape in modern day what's happening, you know, like what James did with smothering Mary. I almost called her Maria. You know, it's a little difficult to tell what's happening, you know, even to the point where Jill was like, what happened? I couldn't even tell what was going on. Did he kill her? And, you know, it was kind of one of those things where it was actually difficult to tell that that's what's happening. Now, in the original, it wasn't exactly like, you know, the easiest thing, but I did find that it wasn't nearly as hard to tell what was going on. So it's one of those things, again, a give and take. You know, I don't find this remake to be a replacement for Silent Hill 2. I do think that that's where this kind of thing becomes frustrating, because people feel that it is. Now, there are people who feel like it is out of like a malice, where they feel like old game bad, and I don't like people like that. I think that's really short-sighted and narrow-minded. But there's also people who believe that it is in terms of thinking that the only reason it exists is to replace the original. They think, oh, well, this game is a threat to the original. I don't think that either. Like, I don't think this game did anything to tarnish the original's legacy, but I do think that Konami did such a bad job of preserving the original Silent Hill games. If you know anything about the situation around the Silent Hill PS3 and Xbox 360 era HD remasters, they were a mess. You know why? Because they had to redo entire audio bits. They gave the actual developers, they gave them also incomplete builds of the game because they lost the source code for different games and they lost the complete builds. So it was something where they kind of had to start from not even the finish line of the original release because of what happened there and work to try and make it, and it was just a mess. And because of that, I'd argue that the original games, other than by people like the teams behind the definitive edition of Silent Hill 2, and I believe there's also one being worked on for Silent Hill 3, teams like that, they're the ones preserving these games. Like, other than them, it seems to me like the corporate side of Konami and the corporate side of these different game development studios, they haven't done a very good job of preserving their own games. And I actually think that if they had, there would be a lot less pushback to this game. That's something I did mention in my Is It Worth Buying? But it's something I want to mention here, that this game has become difficult to talk about, difficult to review, difficult to not get into some culture war dumb argument about, because the original is not well preserved except on PC. Not everybody has a PC. And so it's one of those things where the access to it is limited, also because, CRT TVs are not as common as they used to be. Not everybody has a PS2 either. And also the PS2 disc of Silent Hill 2 is something like $200 now. So all of these things have gotten kind of ridiculous, and I think that they've built up kind of a bad will around Silent Hill 2 and around Silent Hill 2 Remake, because it's a game that did land close for a lot of people. A lot of people, whether they had been through that emotional trauma or not, they could empathize with it, they could recognize it, they could experience it alongside James. And I think that when you have a game like Silent Hill 2, where it's so forgotten by the rights holders in terms of its preservation, the original, that when you release a remake, it's going to be harshly judged because of that, because people are going to view it as a replacement on both sides of that discussion, and I think that's too bad. And I think that both of those are very valid experiences that I really, really like. I don't think it has to be one or the other, and that's kind of how I wanted to end this, is I don't think Silent Hill 2 is a threat to the original Silent Hill 2, this remake. I don't think it's a threat to that. I just think it's really too bad that there hasn't been more of an effort to preserve the original. And what I really hope is that at some point Konami just kind of buckles down and says, we're going to pay the people who did the definitive edition to port this game, to help us with it. That's what I would love out of those, original Silent Hills, so that it didn't have to be this discussion anymore. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. I really enjoyed this game. I love this game. It hit me in the feels several times, but I thought it was great. If you want to support this channel, we do have memberships. We have Patreon. These different things have different content on them. But I will say that we also have our other channels like JayRPG, a channel where I review, make videos on, and talk about role-playing games, Japanese role-playing games, Korean role-playing games, all kinds of stuff over there, like my favorite Stellar Blade. And also we do have a channel dedicated to anime, manga, stuff like that. That's Magical Jill, and a channel where we play through games together, Degenerate Plays, where we played through the original PlayStation 1 Silent Hill together and hung out with you guys. So I hope you'll check that out too. We also have a Fortnite code, which is DJAY123, and we do have a store, cosmobunny.shop, where you can buy coasters, keychains, trays, and more from recycled, repurposed comic book, manga, and magazine pages. Now, these are really awesome. They're basically taken from manga, magazines, etc. that were damaged, but we, kind of transform that into new art, save a little bit of that to make something new, and then, of course, as well, we will recycle the rest. So we appreciate you. Hope you'll check these things out. Have a fantastic day, and as always, everyone, stay shui.